Welcome to the online class lecture of Professor S.K. Paul, University Department of English, BRABU, Muzaffarpur. Dear students of 4th semester, welcome to my class, and I say good morning to you. So this class is meant for EC1, that is the group division, EC1, group American literature, and today I am going to discuss Mark Twain, the author, and his novel Huckleberry Finn. This is a part of American literature. So here I do begin. Samuel Langhorne Clemens, born in November 30, 1835, and died in the year April 21, 1910, known by his pen name Mark Twain. Mark Twain. So he was an American writer, humorist, entrepreneur, publisher, and lecturer. He was lauded as the greatest humorist, humorist the United States has produced, and William Faulkner called him the father of American literature. His novels include The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, published in 1876, and its sequel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, published in 1884, the latter often called the Great American Novel. Twain was raised in Hannibal, Missouri, which later provided the setting for Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. He served an apprenticeship with a printer and then worked as a typesetter, contributing articles to the newspaper of his older brother Orion Clemens. He later became a riverboat pilot on the Mississippi River before heading west to join Orion in Nevada. He referred humorously to his lack of success at mining, turning to journalism for the Virginia City Territorial Enterprise. His humorous story, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, was published in 1865 based on a story that he heard at Angel's Hotel in Angel's Camp, California. California, where he had spent some time as a miner. The short story brought international attention and was even translated into French. His wit and satire in prose and in speech earned praise from critics and peers, and he was a friend of presidents, artists, industrialists, and European royalty. Twain earned a great deal of money from his writings and lectures, but he invested in ventures that lost most of it, such as the compositor, a mechanical typesetter that failed because of its complexity and imprecision. He filed for bankruptcy in the wake of these financial setbacks, but in time overcame his financial troubles with the help of Henry Huttleston Rogers. He eventually paid all the creditors in full, even though his bankruptcy relieved him of having to do so. Twain was born shortly after an appearance of Halley's comet, and he predicted that he would go out with it as well. He died the day after the comet made its closest approach to the Earth. Mark Twain was Born on November 30, 1835, I have just mentioned in the beginning, in Florida, Missouri. He was the sixth of seven children of Jane 1830 and a native of Kentucky, and John Marshall Clemens 1798 to 1847, a native of Virginia. His parents met when his father moved to Missouri. They were married in 1823. Twain was a Cornish, English, and Scots-Irish descent. Only three of his siblings survived childhood: Orion, Henry, and Pamela. His brother, Pleasant Hannibal, died at 3 weeks of age. His sister, Marguerite, when Twain was three, and his brother, Benjamin, 3 years later. When he was four, Twain's family moved to Hannibal, Missouri, a port town on the Mississippi River that inspired the fictional town of St. Petersburg in the adventures of Tom Sawyer and the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Slavery was legal in Missouri at the time, and, and it became a theme in these writings. His father was an attorney and judge who died of pneumonia in 1847 when Twain was 11. The following year, Twain left school after the fifth grade to become a printer's apprentice. In 1851, he began working as a typesetter, contributing articles and humorous sketches to the Hannibal Journal, a newspaper that Orion owned. When he was 18, he left Hannibal and worked as a printer in New York City, Philadelphia, St. Louis, and Cincinnati, joining the newly formed International Typographical Union, the Printers' Trade Union. He educated himself in public libraries in the evenings, finding a wider information than at a conventional school. Twain describes his boyhood in life on the Mississippi, stating that there was one but permanent ambition among his comrades to be a steamboat man. Pilot was the grandest position of all. The pilot, even in those days of trivial wages, had a princely salary from $150 to $250 a month and no board to pay. As Twain described it, the pilot's prestige exceeded that of the captain. The pilot had to get up a warm personal acquaintanceship with every old snag and one limbed cottonwood and every obscure wood pile that ornaments the banks of the river for 1200 miles and more than must actually know where these things are in the dark. As a young pilot, Clemens served on the steamer A.B. Chambers with Grant Marsh, who became famous for his exploits as a steamboat captain on the Missouri River. The two liked each other and admired one another and maintained a correspondence for many years after Clemens left the river. While training, Samuel convinced his younger brother Henry to work with him and even arranged a post of mud clerk for him on the steamboat Pennsylvania. On June 13, 1858, the steamboat's boiler exploded. Henry succumbed to his wounds on June 2021. Twain claimed to have foreseen this death in a dream a month earlier, which inspired his interest in parapsychology. He was an early member of the Society for Psychical Research. Twain was guilt stricken and held himself responsible for the rest of his life. He continued to work on the river and was a river pilot. Until the Civil War broke out in 1861, when traffic was curtailed along the Mississippi River. At the start of hostilities, he enlisted briefly in a local Confederate unit. He later wrote the sketch, The Private History of a Campaign That Failed, describing how he and his friends had been Confederate volunteers for 2 weeks before disbanding. He, he then left for Nevada to work for his brother Orion, who was secretary of the Nevada Territory. Twain describes the episode in his book Roughing It. Orion became secretary to Nevada Territory Governor James W. Nye in 1861, and Twain joined him when he moved west. The brothers traveled more than 2 weeks on a stagecoach across the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains, visiting the Mormon community in Salt Lake City. Twain's journey ended in the silver mining town of Virginia City, Nevada, where he became a miner on the Comstock lode. He failed as a miner and went to work at the Virginia City newspaper. When he wrote a humorous, he failed as a miner and went to work at the Virginia City as the Virginia City newspaper, territorial enterprise, working under a friend, the writer Dan T. Quill. He first used his pen name here on February 3, 1863, when he wrote a humorous travel account titled Letter from Carson, replied Joe Goodman, party at Governor Johnson's music, and signed it Mark Twain. His experiences in the American West inspired Roughing It, written during 1871 to 71 and published in 1872. He experiences in Angel's Camp in Calaveras County, California, providing material for the celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County, 1865. Twain moved to San Francisco in 1864, still a journalist, and met writers such as Bret Hardy and Artemus Ward. He may have been romantically involved with the poet Ina Coolbert. His first success as a writer came when his humorous tall tale, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, was published on November 18, 1865 in the New York Weekly, the Saturday Press, bringing him national attention. A year later, he traveled to the Sandwich Islands, present-day Hawaii, as a reporter for the Sacramento Union. His letters to the Union were popular and became the basis for his first lectures. In 1867, a local newspaper funded his trip to the Mediterranean aboard the Quaker City, including a tour of Europe and the Middle East. He wrote a collection of travel letters which were later compiled as The Innocents Abroad, 1869. It was on this trip that he met fellow passenger Charles Langdon, who showed him a picture of his sister Olivia. Sister Olivia. Twain later claimed to have fallen in love at first sight. Upon returning to the United States, Twain was offered honorary membership in Yale University's secret society Scroll and Key in 1868. In November 1872, Twain was a passenger on the Cunard Line, a steamship Batavia, which rescued the 9 surviving crew of the British bark Charles Ward. Twain witnessed the rescue and wrote to Royal Humane Society recommending them to honor Batavia's captain and the crew that manned the lifeboat. Starting in 1873, Twain moved his family. To Hartford, Connecticut, where where he arranged the building of a home next door to Stowe in the 1870s and 1880s. The family summered at Quarry Farm in Elmira, the home of Olivia's sister, Susan Crane, in 1874. Susan had a study built apart from the main house so that Twain would have a quiet place in which to write also. He smoked cigars constantly and Susan did not want him to do so in her house. Twain wrote many of his classic novels during his 17 years in Hartford. He from 1874 to 1891 and over 20 summers at Quarry Farm. They include The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, 1876, The Prince and the Pauper, 1881, Life on the Mississippi, 1883, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, 1884, and A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, 1889. The couple's marriage lasted 34 years until Olivia's death in 1904. All the Clemens family are buried in Elmira's Woodlawn Cemetery. Twain was fascinated with science and scientific inquiry. He developed a close and lasting friendship with Nikola Tesla, and the two spent much time together in Tesla's laboratory. Twain patented 3 inventions, including an improvement in adjustable and detachable success was detachable straps for garments to replace suspenders, and a history trivia game. Most commercially successful was a self-pasting scrapbook, a tried adhesive on the pages needed only to be moistened before use. Over 25,000 books were sold. Twain was an early proponent of fingerprinting as a forensic technique, featuring it in A Tall Tale in Life on the Mississippi, 1883, and as a central plot element in the novel Pudd'nhead Wilson, published in 1894. Twain's novel, A Connecticut, a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, 1889, features a time traveler from the contemporary US using his knowledge of science to introduce modern technology to Arthurian England. This type of historical manipulation became a trope of speculative fiction as alternate histories. In 1909, Thomas Edison visited Twain at Stormfield, his home in Reading, Connecticut, and filmed him. Part of the footage was used in The Prince and the Pauper, published in 1909, a two-reel short film. It is the only known existing film footage of Twain. Twain made a substantial amount of money through his writing, but he lost a great deal through investments. He invested mostly in new inventions and technology, particularly the page typesetting machine. It was a beautifully engineered mechanical marvel that amazed viewers when it worked, but it was prone to breakdowns. Twain's writings and lectures enabled him to recover financially, combined with the help of his friend Henry Huddleston Rogers. In 1893, he began friendship with the financier, a principal of Standard Oil, that lasted the remainder of his life. Rogers first made Rogers first made him file for bankruptcy in April 1894, then had him transfer the copyrights on his written works to his wife to prevent creditors from gaining possession of them. Finally, Rogers took absolute charge of Twain's money until all his creditors were paid. Twain accepted an offer from Robert Sparrow Smythe and embarked on a year-long around the world lecture tour in July 1895 to pay off his creditors in full, although he was no longer under any legal obligation to do so. It was a long, arduous journey, and he was sick much of the time, mostly from a cold and a carbuncle. The first part of the itinerary took him across Northern America to British Columbia, Canada, until the second half of August. For the second part, he sailed across the Pacific Ocean. His scheduled lectures in Honolulu, Hawaii, had to be cancelled due to cholera epidemic. Twain went on to Fiji, Australia, New Zealand, Sri Lanka, India, Mauritius, and South Africa. His three months in India became the centerpiece of the 712-page book. Following the equator in the second half of July 1896, he sailed back to England, spent 4 more years in Europe, mainly in England and Austria, October 1897 to May 1899, with longer spells in London and Vienna. Clara had wished to study the piano under Theodor Leschetizky in Vienna. However, Jean's health did not benefit from consulting with specialists in Vienna, the city of doctors. The family moved to London in spring 1899, following a lead by uh, Pulteney uh, Bigelow, who had a good experience being treated by Dr. Jonas Henrik Kellgren, a Swedish osteo- osteopathic practitioner in. mm, Again, Twain accepted an offer from Robert Sparrow Smythe and embarked on a year-long around the world lecture tour in July 1895 to pay off his creditors in full. Jean's health did not benefit from consulting with specialists in Vienna, the city of doctors. The family moved to London in spring 1899, following a lead by Pulteney Bigelow, who had a good experience being treated by Dr. Jonas Henrik Kellgren, a Swedish osteopathic practitioner in Belgravia. They were persuaded to spend the summer at Kellgren's sanatorium by the lake in the Swedish village of Sanna. Coming back in fall, they continued the treatment in London until Twain was convinced by lengthy inquiries in America that a similar osteopathic experience was available there. In mid 1900, he was the guest of newspaper proprietor Hugh Gilson Reed at Dolly's Hill House, located on the north side of London. Twain wrote that he had never seen any place that was so satisfactorily situated with its noble trees and stretch of country and everything that went to make life delightful, and all within a biscuit's throw of the metropolis of the world. He then returned to America in October 1900, having learned enough to pay off his debts. In winter 1901, Twain became the country's most prominent opponent of imperialism, raising the issue in his speeches, interviews, and writings. In January 1901, he became serving as vice president of the Anti Imperialist League of New York. Twain was in great demand as a featured speaker, performing solo humorous talks similar to modern stand-up comedy. He gave he gave paid talks to many men's clubs, including the Authors Club, Beef Stick Club, Vagabonds, White Friars, and Monday Evening Club of Hartford. In the 1890s, he spoke of the Savage Club. In the late 1890s, he spoke to the Savage Club in London and was elected an honorary member. He was told that only three men had been so honored, including the Prince of Wales, and he replied, "Well, it must make the prince feel mighty, mighty fine." He visited Melbourne and Sydney in 1895 as part of a world lecture tour. In 1897, he spoke to the Concordia Press Club in Vienna as a special guest following the diplomat Charmley, uh, Charmley, Charmley Tower Jr. He delivered the speech. He delivered the speech, "The Horrors of the German Language," in German to the great amusement of the audience. In 1901, he was invited to speak at Princeton University Theosophic Literary Society, where he was made an honorary member. Mark Twain gave pleasure, real intellectual enjoyment to millions, and his works will continue to give such pleasure to millions yet to come. His humor was American, but he was nearly as much appreciated by Englishmen and people of other countries as by his own countrymen. He has made an enduring part of American literature. Twain began his career writing a light, humorous verse, but he became a chronicler of the vanities, hypocrisies, and murderous acts of mankind. At mid career, he combined rich humor, sturdy narrative, and social criticism in Huckleberry film. He was a master of rendering colloquial speech and helped to create and popularize a distinctive American literature built on American themes and language. Many of his works have been suppressed at times for various reasons. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn has been repeatedly restricted in American high schools, not least for its frequent use of the word nigger, which was in common usage in the pre Civil War period in which the novel was set. It was in these days that Twain became a writer of the sagebrush school. He was known later as its most famous member. His first important work was the celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, published in the New York Saturday Press on November 18, 1865. After a burst of popularity, the Sacramento Union commissioned him to write letters about his travel experiences. The first journey that he took for his job was to ride the steamer Ajax on its maiden voyage to the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii. All the while he was writing letters to the newspaper that were meant for publishing, chronicling his experiences with humor. These letters proved to be the genesis to his work with the San Francisco Alta California newspaper, which designated him a traveling correspondent for a trip from San Francisco to New York City via Panama, Panama Isthmus. Twain's next work drew on his experiences on the Mississippi River. Old Times on the Mississippi was a series of sketches published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1875, featuring his disillusionment with romanticism. Old Times eventually became the starting point for life on the Mississippi. Twixt Twain's Next major publication was The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which draws on his youth in Hannibal. Tom Sawyer was modeled on Twain as a child, with traces of schoolmates John Briggs and Will Bowen. The book also introduces Huckleberry Finn in a supporting role based on Twain's boyhood friend Tom Blankenship. The Prince and the Pauper was not as well received despite a storyline that is common in film and literature today. The book tells the story of two boys born on the same day who are physically identical, acting as a social commentary as the prince and pauper switch places. Twain had started Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which he consistently had problems completing, and had completed his travel book, A Tramp Abroad, which describes his travels through Central and Southern Europe. Twain's next major published work was The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which confined him as a noteworthy American writer. Some have called it the first great American novel, and the book has become required reading in many schools throughout the United States. Huckleberry Finn was an offshoot from Tom Sawyer and had a more serious tone than its predecessor. 400 manuscript pages were written in mid 1876, right after the publication of Tom Sawyer. The last fifth of Huckleberry Finn is subject to much controversy. Some say that Twain experienced a failure of nerve, as critic Leo Marx puts it. Ernest Hemingway once said of Huckleberry Finn, "If you read it, you must stop where the nigger Jim is stolen from the boys. That is the real end. The rest is just cheating." Hemingway also wrote in the same essay, "All modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn." Near the completion of Huckleberry Finn, Twain wrote Life on the Mississippi, which was said to have heavily influenced the novel. The travel work recounts Twain's memories and new experiences after a 22-year absence from the Mississippi River. In it, he also explains that Mark Twain was the call made when the boat was in safe water, indicating a depth of 2 or main fathoms, 12 feet or 3.7 meters. Sorry. The McDowell's Cave, now known as Mark Twain Cave in Hannibal, Missouri, and frequently mentioned in Twain's books. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer has Sam Clemens, Twain's real name, engraved on the wall by Twain himself. Twain's next venture was a work of straight fiction that he called Personal Recollection of Joan of Arc, and dedicated to his life. He had long said that this was the work that he was most proud of, despite the criticism that he received for it. The book had been a dream of his since childhood, dream of his since childhood, and he claimed that he had found a manuscript detailing the life of Joan of Arc when he was an adolescent. This was another piece that he was convinced would save the publishing company. His financial advisor, Henry Huddleston Rogers, quashed that the idea and got Twain out of that business altogether, but the book was published nonetheless. George Eliot, Jane Austen, and Robert Louis Stevenson also fell under Twain's attack during this time period, beginning around 1890 and continuing until his death, that is in 89. He outlines what he considers to be quality writing in several letters and essays, in addition to providing a source for the tooth and claw style of literary criticism. He places emphasis on concision, utility of word choice, and realism. He complains, for example, that Cooper's Deer Slayer purports to be realistic, but but has several shortcomings. Ironically, several of his own works were later criticized for lack of continuity. Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and Organization Pudd'nhead Wilson. Twain's last work was his autobiography, which he dictated and thought would be most entertaining if he went off on whims and tangents in non chronological order. Some archivists and compilers have rearranged the biography into a more conventional form, thereby eliminating some of Twain's humor and the flow of the book. The first volume of the autobiography, over 736 pages, was published by the University of California in November 2010, 100 years after his death, as Twain wished it. Twain's works have been subjected to censorship efforts, according to Stewart. Leading these banning campaigns generally were religious organizations or individuals in positions of influence, not so much working librarians who had been instilled with that American library spirit which honored intellectual freedom within bounds of course. In 1905, the Brooklyn Public Library banned both the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and the Adventures of Tom Sawyer from the children's department because of their language. Twain's views became more radical as he grew older. In a letter to friend and fellow writer William Dean Howells in 1887, he acknowledged that his views had changed and developed over his lifetime, referring to one of his favorite works. When, says Tom Twain, when I finished Carlyle's French Revolution in 1871, I was a Girondin. Every time I have read it since, I have read it differently, being influenced and changed little by life and environment. And now I lay the book down once more and recognize that I am a sensoculot and not a pale, characterless sensoculot, but a barat. Before 1899, Twain was an ardent imperialist. In the late 1860s and early 1870s, he spoke out strongly in favor of American interests in the Hawaiian island. He said the war with Spain in 1899 was the worthiest war ever fought. In 1899, however, he reversed course. In the New York Herald, October 16, 1900, Twain describes his transformation and political awakening in the context of Philippine-American War to anti-imperialism. I wanted the American eagle to go screaming into the Pacific. Why not spread its wings over the Philippines? I asked myself. I said to myself, here are people who have suffered for 3 centuries. We can make them as free as ourselves, give them a government and country of their own, but a miniature of the American Constitution afloat in the Pacific, start a brand new republic to take its place among the free nations of the world. It seemed it seemed to me a great task to which we had addressed ourselves. But I have thought some more since then, and I have read carefully the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Spanish American War. And I have seen that we do not intend to flee, but to subjugate the people of the Philippines. We have gone through, we have gone there to conquer, not to redeem. It seems to me, be our pleasure and duty to make those people free and let them deal with their own domestic questions in their own way. And so I am an anti-imperialist. I am opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land. During the Boxer Rebellion, Twain said that the Boxer is a patriot. He loves his country better than he does the countries of other people. I wish him success. From 1901 and soon after his return from Europe until his death in 1910, Twain was vice president of the American Anti-Imperialist League, which opposed the annexation of the Philippines by the United States and had tens of thousands of members. He wrote many political pamphlets for the organization. The incident in the Philippines, posthumously published in 1924, was in response to the Moro Crater massacre, in which 600 Moros were killed. Many of his neglected and previously uncollected writings on an anti-imperialism appeared for the first time in book form in 1992. Thank you. This way I have completed my lecture for the day. Now this lecture is over. Your class is also over. Thank you.